Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back with the Gameweek 12 cheat sheet. Now, of course, this week I think the interesting thing, of course, is we have this international break, and a lot of the transfers can be related to people who might be, having their wild cards, and also kind of looking at, the fact that we've already gone through one third of the season so far, and probably are looking to kind of consolidate some kind of options and look for more medium to long range kind of picks that could be, either differentials or assets that have done exceptionally well so far, and we'd kind of like to hop on the bandwagon for. And I think that is kind of reflected in terms of the defense, and that's why defense, for example, is one of those positions where there really hasn't been any movement at all. I think what's actually been set in stone in the last few weeks, if we actually look at defense, is just simply the fact that options, in the lower range in terms of Apilicueta and Diaz have kind of fallen off the priority, whereas options like Chilwell/Reece James or even Cancelo and Trent seem to be absolute locks for people's teams. I think the only question really is whether you're going for a back three or a back four, and Livermento obviously being that kind of fifth piece who can play, when the game or the fixture is right. So that kind of has changed the defense to make it a little bit stale, in my opinion. I think, of course, there's still a decision, I think, to go between James and Chilwell, but it seems like, of course, recently, I think just from the production and also the underlying stats, it seems like James has trended a little bit better. And for that reason, I think a lot of people have moved to James, if they had the option to do that and didn't go for Chilwell beforehand. But of course, these kind of things are also up to kind of form, and it's not like James will be on sky high production over the course of the season. I imagine there will be game weeks where Chilwell, just like in the past in the season, will do better than James, but we'll see kind of what happens there. If we actually look higher up in terms of the kind of budget players, I think the only additional option is the addition of Ben Johnson, but he really doesn't interest me that much, right? He's a differential because I think he can be displaced by Soufal at any minute, and even though for the moment he has taken priority over Soufal, it just doesn't seem like he's that appealing of an option, and I think it makes a lot more sense for us to actually hold assets that are 4.5 or 4.4, really in that kind of range as a fourth or fifth defender if you are operating like a back three, especially since Livermento has become such a good option. I imagine most of us already have Livermento, but if you have him, if you didn't get the chance to have him now, I think 4.5 is still a very good price to have him, given the fact that Southampton have looked quite good defensively, and also Livermento provides a lot on the offensive end, which most other 4.5 players do not. And then, when we're actually looking at rounding out teams, those kind of picks like Cody or even Duffy can I think slowly be moved into assets like Lamptey Mitchell at the 4.5 range, and someone like Dyer or even Ben White can be considered, right? Because these are players playing for what I would argue to be top half teams that are probably going to get quite a few clean sheets due to the kind of managerial structures that they have in place. Conte coming in with the back three, I think has the hopes of improving the Tottenham defense, and that makes Dyer, I think, a little bit interesting. Conversely, though, I think Pinnock and Janssen and pretty much any Brentford defender so far this season just hasn't been interesting whatsoever. In the latest weeks, because we've actually seen them play exceptionally poorly versus the bottom half of the league, and that's been a big worry. We saw, for example, Brentford giving great games to Chelsea and Liverpool at home, but I think the worry is with these kind of recent performances, playing versus much weaker opposition and showing out so poorly and being able to concede so freely, that the Brentford defense is something that we can move on, and that has also kind of been in a sense impacted as well by the Raya injury. And I think at this moment in time, it's pretty much the moment to move out of the Brentford defense, right? So if you have the kind of capacity to go for White or Dyer, it makes a lot of sense. In terms of the defense, I think the only other option I'd add is maybe Gabriel from Arsenal, and a lot of people get a question why it really makes sense when you have options like Tavares, when you have options like White or even Tomiyasu who are much cheaper. I just think with Gabriel, he is obviously a huge offensive threat. Physically, he is the most imposing defender of the team, and he kind of has that kind of dunk potential, right? Where if you keep him for the rest of the season, maybe he is a starter for you. He could actually amass a lot of points. Now, I'm not sure actually a lot of people actually went for dunk last season, even though he had an exceptional kind of year in terms of just both scoring and also getting and racking up bonus points, which Gabriel actually does very well. But, I think Gabriel is that kind of option there. And if you want a differential and you may be looking to spend the money that, for example, you could have spent previously in the past in someone like Semedo, and you're looking for a like kind of trade for a better defense, then I think Gabriel makes a lot of sense. Defensively, I think there's not too many kind of changes this week, and as I said, it's really impacted by the fact that we have consolidated our position over, basically justifying that a City, a Liverpool, and a Chelsea defender are pretty much must-haves at this point in the season. I don't really think anything will change from that kind of point of view. But at this moment in time, I'd love to shout out OneFootball. We've been working with them for several videos now. OneFootball is a football app that you can use as an Android or an iPhone user to pretty much track any kind of football news available. For example, in the international break, you can actually check the live stats of particular games. The Spain and Sweden game, for example, happened today. Portugal and Serbia, huge kind of games with huge ramifications for the World Cup happened today. So a lot of kind of big news in terms of a little bit of upsets in terms of Portugal losing as well, and then also Spain, with a kind of guiding light in terms of Gavi having a fantastic performance in front of 50,000 fans. You can pretty much also track any kind of Premier League team, any kind of top flight European team, or any kind of local team in any kind of national league around the world on the app. And you can also follow the European fixtures as well. The app's fantastic in terms of kind of looking at statistical updates as well, and press conferences, and kind of making sure that you have all your football news in one place. Please check out the app in the link in the description below. But if we actually look at the midfield, where I think there's actually been a lot of movement, I think it's been more of a situation where it seems like Gallagher and Smith Rowe have done fantastically, and one thing I would say about Smith Rowe is, even though I have selected him as the best option, and he still remains there, I think he's been exceptionally clinical so far this season, and Arsenal actually haven't been building too many attacks. I think his, for example, expected goals and expected assist numbers aren't actually as high as I'd hope him to have, in a sense, but he has basically become a talismanic player for Arsenal just due to the fact that he is so integral to, first of all, building the counterattacks and actually playmaking in that kind of sense, but also now actually finding himself in drifting into position so that he can actually take in these kind of rebounds and make sure that he capitalizes on these kind of opportunities from late runs into the box, and I have to say he's done tremendously well there. Whether I think this is a short stint of kind of form, or someone who is basically someone who overachieves in terms of XG, and we can expect to do so in the future, is something I'm still a little bit unsure of. I still think that Arsenal aren't building that many attacks. I think when we're actually tossing up both Smith Rowe and Gallagher, I'd actually be a little bit more interested in Gallagher, just due to the fact that Gallagher's fixtures are very nice. Now, he, of course, is playing centre mid, which is not as, I guess, attackingly effective as a position as Smith Rowe, but I think Gallagher is a little bit more talismanic for this Crystal Palace side, just in terms of how many chances he's kind of taking a part in and how involved he is in the play. I think Smith Rowe has been very good in terms of finding himself recently in matches to actually capitalize on positions, but in terms of actually building consistent attacks and getting kind of consistent output, I would say maybe he falls just a bit short of Gallagher, but I still think they're both fantastic options. And Mbeumo is someone who has to fall for me, and it's really due to the fact that Brentford have really struggled as of late to kind of find form, and just really haven't impressed at all from an offensive front. In fact, it's more the case now that we're seeing that Brentford are collapsed defensively, and that really means much less output from someone like Mbeumo, and much less control for him to actually find pockets in behind and spaces in behind where he was able to kind of create these shots and actually rack up the amount of post shots that he hit early on in the season. With Everton, I have to say that, especially with the Dominic Calvert-Lewin news, I really think that both Gray and Townsend just aren't interesting options whatsoever. They're clearly options that you want to move away from. I think Everton, from a kind of personnel level, are definitely struggle with most of the team, definitely struggling with most of the kind of teams in the league, and it really takes a specific kind of side in terms of teams that are looking to actually hit Everton on the counter, or maybe kind of play possessive football without much kind of, I think, defensive spine in behind. So a good kind of example would be United, for example, where we saw that Gray and Townsend and Doucouré were able to capitalize on things. And now, of course, with Doucouré, I think, coming back into the side, that might be a little bit of a boost for Everton. But definitely, I think, the impact of Gray and Townsend were a little bit short. Gray, I think, still has potential dividends over the course of the season, because for me, he gets much more involved in open play, and I like him for that point of view. Townsend is someone you're kind of looking for a penalty shout, but with Everton having so little control over the games recently, I would say, you're not really going to get that from Townsend. The expectation that he can take penalties here and there, and especially when the fixtures are getting extremely tough for Everton. So this is kind of a crossroads where it makes sense to clearly go for someone like Smith Rowe or Gallagher, or even wait a little bit so that West Ham's fixtures kind of clean up a little bit, and you go for someone a little bit more expensive in Bowen, who's in fantastic form. Now, of course, when we actually look to the 5.9 to the 6.7 territory, there's only been two movements there, really, and it's the addition of Trossard. I have to hold my hands up and say I was wrong about Trossard. I didn't really expect him to actually get a haul versus Newcastle, and he did fantastically in that sense. Obviously, I think Newcastle have actually scraped once again a couple of draws this season where, like just in the two previous years of the Newcastle regime under Mike Ashley, we've seen, kind of Newcastle sneaking away with, I would say, wins. We're overperforming certain matches, right? And I think they did that, for example, versus Crystal Palace and versus Brighton. They were actually quite threatening in both games, and that's been quite a worry, I would say, at times for maybe a side like Crystal Palace and Brighton. You expect them to do better in those games, but it also shows that, in the structure, I think recently with Potter giving a little bit more faith to Trossard playing in a much more advanced position, almost as a false nine, that he can be an exceptionally interesting asset and could arguably be considered as someone who's out of position, in my opinion. And I think that's what makes him so interesting right now. I think he is someone, in my opinion, who's not exactly the most clinical player, but given the fact that he will be playing such advanced positions and will have the most chances, he might be a good differential to have because his ownership is so low, and the Brighton fixtures are actually quite clean. With Saka, I think he has to fall just due to the fact that when you're looking across the kind of alley to Smith Rowe and him being so much cheaper, and the fixtures maybe arguably being a little bit more tough than in the past, then I think we have to say that it makes more sense to kind of better spend that money, right? With someone like Bowen, who is in this list, or someone like Cornet, they're clearly playing out of position. I think Cornet is clearly playing out of position. Bowen isn't necessarily playing out of position. He obviously plays right mid for the team, but he also has impacts in terms of taking set pieces, and that's something that Saka doesn't have access to, right? So we've seen this season that Bowen has actually had a lot of contributions simply due to the fact that he's taken assists from the right-hand side of the corners, and that's really impacted him and kind of made him interesting even within the kind of tough fixtures. For Saka, I would say the fact that Smith Rowe is just doing so well and performing so well at a much cheaper price just means that there's no real reason to get him. It's kind of like the situation with Benrahma, where when Benrahma is kind of out of form, he's found himself out of this list, whereas Bowen has reasons for us to keep him or actually kind of look towards him as an option in the future. I still think the time is really to have a consideration for looking at Cornet as a differential, because obviously whilst Rafinha still is a good option, I'd say arguably for the next 2-3 weeks, just due to the fact that he's in such fine personal form. Leeds aren't in great form. Their fixtures will get tough, and those are the games where I think he'll be starved out of being able to create kind of chances by himself. And Cornet, in my opinion, is playing for a Burnley side who have had a little bit of a resurgence, in my opinion, from the start of the season where they looked very poor. They've actually managed to bag a few draws and actually create more chances over the last few games, especially playing Cornet in a much more advanced position, this kind of 4-4-2 structure where he's allowed to be that kind of more free-roaming kind of striker alongside Chris Wood, who plays a much more target man role. And I really like what Cornet is doing over in Burnley. I think that will be quite interesting for him to look at. He's definitely going to be, once again, a differential that I basically suggested 2 weeks ago that we should kind of look at this kind of pivotal fixture stage. So he's definitely an interesting option. I think he remains there as an interesting option just below Rafinha. In terms of the 6.9 to 7.7 territory, I would have to say that Jota has to rise. Even though Mane is injured, and that actually arguably makes it slightly worse for Jota, not in the sense that he isn't nailed anymore, but just the fact that even though he is nailed, losing Mane is quite a big, I think, asset to kind of lose, and someone who definitely would have traditionally been drawing defenders away from Jota, and that maybe makes him a little bit less interesting, because with Mane and Firmino out, you're probably looking at someone like Origi, who could be an option. I'm not going to include him in my list right now until I really see what happens, because Klopp could easily play Minamino in some games, right, just to kind of see what kind of structure is being played. But Jota is definitely an interesting option. I still think that overall the firepower of the Liverpool side, when Fabinho's back in and you have those kind of fullbacks still kind of providing so much space and width and also kind of attacking output and chances, then Jota will be a fantastic option, especially at that price. So a lot of people who maybe were looking to get to Son might actually be considering to go for Jota instead. He's cheaper. He plays for arguably a better team in terms of just how well oiled this kind of Liverpool attacking side is, even with Mane and Firmino out. And it just makes a lot more sense, I think, to kind of spend that money in Jota if you haven't already spent that money on Son. In terms of Bernardo Silva, I actually think he has to rise, because I think he's had a lot of great output in several games now. Whether it's just one small assist or one kind of goal, I think, yes, he hasn't had the explosive haul, for example, like Foden, but you also have to look at the Foden game and where he exploded and for a brace and kind of consider the fact that, I mean, it was a little bit undeserved, right? One was just a rebound, and we've seen actually Bernardo Silva in the last few weeks play very advanced positions, thread in some fantastic through balls that could have been great assists, has gotten several assists and goals himself already himself, and is much cheaper than actually most of those options around that 7.5 plus range. So for me, Bernardo Silva sits at a very interesting price range where if you, let's say, haven't already gone for Foden, then it might make sense to actually go for a little bit more of a differential approach and actually go for Bernardo Silva. I wouldn't double up on the Man City midfield in that sort of way, but definitely as a differential to Foden himself makes a lot of sense. Zaha is someone as well who kind of sits in that range where now that you actually have a Crystal Palace side who's playing progressive attacking football, it probably does justify Zaha's price, right? He is clearly the first or second talismanic player, depending on how you really interpret the way Crystal Palace attack. He's clearly crucial in the final third, and he gets a lot of the touches there and creates a lot of chances himself. But this is probably the right stage and the right kind of conditions to actually consider Zaha as a fantastic asset. And for that reason, I have to say that he rises. And once again, it sits in that kind of territory where maybe arguably when you say Gallagher is so much cheaper and has actually produced almost equally or more than Zaha, it doesn't really make sense to go for Zaha. But once again, he does provide a differential to someone like Gallagher, right? And maybe if you were looking for a direct replacement for some of the other players in this list, such as a Greenwood, for example, who's clearly fallen off priority in recent times, Zaha is a very, very nice differential. But if we actually round out, with the forwards, really, I actually think that the forwards have fundamentally changed due to the impact of how strong defenders have been this season. Players like Cancelo, Reece James, and Trent being so impactful have pretty much meant that the 7.5 kind of price budget or 6.5 price budget that we've allocated to most of our forwards, right, outside of the kind of secondary striker or secondary premium in terms of someone like Kane, Lukaku, Ronaldo, might actually have to be displaced in the future, right, in favor of some of these enablers. And I think when we're looking at Broja and Armstrong, the reason why Broja falls is because of the fact that I think Armstrong has actually been quite in form as of late. Whilst I'm not super high on Armstrong as a player, I think Southampton are building plenty of chances, and as a striker, you can see that he still gets relatively involved in the play. Of course, the fixtures for Southampton were basically at a fantastic kind of patch, and maybe going forwards, it doesn't make the most sense to go for Armstrong and keeping him, but if you manage to bag him basically before this set of fixtures, then you would have pretty much capitalized on the best of Armstrong. And maybe with the Broja injury, I'm not exactly sure how Hasenhüttl will kind of respond to that. So that's why I've kind of fallen him. It's more of the case that he might play a bit more preference to someone who's in form, such as Armstrong, even though Broja himself was basically 2 game weeks ago extremely hot in form and had scored 2 games in a row. Pukki is someone who actually rises for me because, or gets introduced to the list because the fact that there's a managerial change and he still is clearly the talismanic option for this Norwich side. They're, of course, in my opinion, very poor on a man-for-man basis, and he still is slightly pricey at that kind of 5.8, 5.7 range, but for me, I think you have the option as well to go for Pukki because he could be a very, very strong differential, definitely to someone like a Hwang owner or an Armstrong owner, and the fixtures are actually not too bad for Norwich. The only unfortunate thing, of course, is they don't get to play themselves. King falls for the same reason why I've kind of explained how some of the Everton assets have fallen. I think Watford recently have just not been creating anything themselves, and both Watford and Everton really have been exceptionally poor after that kind of 2-5 game. Where the Everton defense collapsed and the Watford attack had suddenly shown some kind of bright glimpse of light for around 20 minutes. But since that kind of, brief moment of encounter of life, we really haven't seen anything from Watford. And I think it reminds me of that kind of Liverpool game where when Ranieri came in, nothing was going along until basically Jurgen Klopp had substituted basically 3/4 of the defense of Liverpool, and Watford were finally able to build attacks. I think that kind of was similar to the Everton game where for most of the game I think Watford weren't producing much and then suddenly things collapsed for Everton. But I really don't think that Watford are of the capability to really surprise teams and to actually create effective attacks, especially with the quality of the league being so high, and I think have to fall King there. The same goes for Tony as well, with playing for a Brentford side who've been exceptionally in poor form. 2 out of 3 of the best fixtures potentially that we could have envisaged for Tony have gone, and he's blanked in both, and that's pretty much the only reason why he falls. I don't think there has to be much more justification to why he falls. He clearly is someone who I think you should be looking to move your money out of in terms of forwards and actually redistribute that into your midfield or your defense in the near future, especially if you don't have someone like Cancelo or Trent. For me, in my kind of personal circumstance, I would love to move Tony into a midfielder because basically if I save or roll a transfer right after game week 12, I can move both Benrahma and Tony into something a little bit more interesting. It could be someone like Jota plus another player, but we'll see what happens in that circumstance. With Jesus, he has to fall for the same reasons why I think the Man City midfielders are so interesting, right? With Foden being a top asset and with Bernardo Silva being a good asset, you have to look at the prices and compare it to Jesus, who really hasn't produced too much more than both of these kind of midfielders, right? The midfielders are also kind of open and have access to these kind of clean sheet points. Jesus is really reliant on the fact that he scores and gets these bonus points, and playing at the right wing as well, he isn't really more talismanic, I'd argue, than any other midfielder in Man City, and for that reason he has to fall. Vardy, for the same reason, falls. I think he just has had multiple weeks now where he's been extremely, I would say, unfortunate with chances. He has been a bit unfortunate with some of these kind of offside VAR calls, but ultimately Leicester hasn't really been producing enough attacks for him to be worth it at that kind of premium price. He still is much more pricier than all the other kind of top tier midfield assets in the game, and when you're looking at them kind of consistently holding week to week, you have to say that kind of money should be redistributed, right? If you want to kind of take this toss up on someone like Kane because he could be a viable captaincy option, that could make sense, but as I say, most of the options and the movements out of the forward positions should be redistributed to the midfield. Lukaku, on the other hand, does rise for me because I still think there's a potential for him to be a differential, right? Like, a lot of people own Kane and Ronaldo, and maybe during this fixture run, it doesn't really make sense to go against that because the fixtures are so nice. But Lukaku coming back and out of injury and maybe kind of being rested and finding his way forward with Chelsea and Tuchel's kind of way of playing with strikers, there could be something in place. I think we have to kind of watch Lukaku a little bit more and make sure that we see a little bit more glimpses and a little bit more interest, right? It can't just be that kind of, like, for example, Arsenal game where Arsenal were pretty much getting collapsed constantly because of their inability to actually play out what they wanted to do out of their back three slash back four structure hybrid that game, where I think Tierney was out of position multiple times due to the fact that Xhaka wasn't really covering his space. But since then we've seen Arsenal tighten up. Since then we've also seen that Chelsea have really been unable to play with Lukaku when he's been isolated up top, and I think it really remains to be seen whether he can be utilized correctly. But if he is, then I think he still becomes a very interesting differential because he's actually dropped a lot of money in recent weeks and could actually be someone who actually gives you a little bit more money to kind of improve your midfield in the meantime, whilst not having to own a Kane or a Ronaldo. Foster actually just finds himself in this list. I don't really know why I haven't put him in this list before, but obviously I think it's because everyone kind of knew he was a guaranteed 4.1 option. There's really no discussion there, but he deserves a place there, and it's a good shout out to the fact that he had a fantastic kind of week, with a penalty save versus Arsenal. So definitely congratulations as well to FPL Focal, who bench boosted Foster. A little bit of a crazy week, of course. You don't really expect Foster, I think, to save a penalty, but fantastic game and fantastic kind of chip play as well. In terms of 4.5 plus keepers, I have to include and kind of improve Guaita on this list. I think when you look at the Crystal Palace fixtures, which is something I'll be talking about in a future video, Guaita makes a lot of sense. I think when I was kind of talking about why I was interested in Mitchell, I think I'm interested in Guaita for many of the same reasons. I think, yes, he might not be kind of committing that many saves because this Crystal Palace team is actually kind of controlling games very well, but I really do imagine that they can get a lot of clean sheets, especially during this period where they should basically finally kind of match up to their underlying stats in terms of defense. And the fact that they've actually posted such great defensive stats so far, even though their fixture run has been one of the top 3 worst fixture runs, means that Guaita makes a lot of sense for me as an option. McCarthy also sits right alongside with him, but I'm a little bit more kind of drawn away from McCarthy due to the fact that Livramento already sits in my team and probably sits in a lot of your teams, right? And I don't really like that kind of double up of a bottom half or mid-table side, as I've kind of argued in the past. In the 5.5 plus territory, I have to drop Martinez. I mean, yes, Dean Smith has just been sacked, arguably, but I think, the Aston Villa side doesn't really justify his price right now. They just really haven't found anything going forward. So now maybe, of course, with Steven Gerrard being a very kind of successful manager in the kind of Scottish division, maybe he can reproduce something like what Brendan Rodgers did in kind of taking Leicester, consistently year on year to a higher level, but it remains to be seen. I think, for now, Martinez has to fall. The Aston Villa defense and the team has been playing, pretty much symbolically. 5 defeats in a row pretty much justifies why Martinez has to fall this week. And that's pretty much it for the kind of game week preview video in terms of a cheat sheet basis. I'll actually be looking to create a kind of formation video and reviewing what I think are the best formations so far in the Premier League, in terms of FPL, and I'll kind of look at a more kind of retrospective kind of underlying stats, and also just looking at how well some kind of assets have performed so far to kind of hypothesize what would be a best formation, which is something that was suggested on the YouTube community panel. On top of that, I'll also be looking at kind of reviewing some of the teams, what kind of aspects of teams that we should target, whether they have kind of offensive or defensive kind of spaces or gaps to kind of capitalize on, and more. But please stay tuned for some of the more videos that will be coming out on the international break, and I'll see you guys very shortly.